The river had never looked so wide. Daniel Okafor stood on the bank of the Kestrel River with rain hammering the collar of his jacket, watching brown water swallow the fence posts that marked the edge of his family's land. 3 days of storms had turned the gentle stream he'd fished in as a boy into something unrecognizable, a churning, restless force that had already taken the old wooden footbridge and half of Mrs. Alvarez's vegetable garden 2 properties down. He was 34 years old, and he had never felt so powerless. It had started, really, 6 months earlier, not with the rain, but with the letter from the hospital. Then the second opinion. Then the diagnosis that his doctor delivered gently, the way people deliver news they wish they didn't have to carry. Stage 3, treatable, they said. Aggressive, but treatable. His wife Naomi had gripped his hand so hard her knuckles went white, and he remembered thinking, absurdly, that he needed to be strong for her, even as the floor seemed to open beneath his own feet. The chemotherapy had drained him in ways he hadn't expected. Not just the sickness, though that was bad enough, but the slow erosion of certainty. He had always been a man who trusted his own strength. He fixed things. He solved problems. He was the one people called when their pipes burst or their cars wouldn't start. But you cannot fix a body that is fighting itself, and you cannot solve a problem by simply working harder at it. For the first time in his life, Daniel had nothing to offer the situation but his presence, and some days even that felt like too little. Now here he was, 5 months into treatment, his hair thinning, his body still recovering from the last round, standing at the edge of a flooding river because the emergency alert had said the levee upstream might not hold, and someone needed to check on old Mr. Whitfield, who lived alone in the cabin near the bend and didn't own a cell phone. Naomi had begged him not to go. "You're not strong enough," she'd said, and he'd seen the fear in her eyes, not just for the water, but for everything the water represented. One more thing trying to take him from her. "Someone has to check on him," Daniel had said. "I'll be careful." He hadn't told her that some stubborn part of him needed this, needed to do something, anything, that made him feel less like a patient and more like a man. The rain had eased slightly by the time he reached the bend, but the river was still rising, fed by the storm further upstream. He could see Whitfield's cabin, and to his relief, smoke rising thin and gray from the chimney. The old man was home, and probably fine, just stubborn and disconnected from the world in the way he'd always been. Daniel exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. That was when he heard it. A high, thin cry, almost lost beneath the roar of the water. He turned toward the sound and saw a dog, Whitfield's old retriever, Biscuit, struggling in the current about 30 feet from shore, paddling frantically against water that was clearly winning. Daniel didn't remember deciding to go in. He remembered the cold hitting him like a wall, remembered his boots filling with water and dragging at his legs, remembered the current seizing him with a strength that made a mockery of every swimming lesson he'd ever taken. He remembered reaching Biscuit, getting an arm under the dog's belly, and then realizing, with a clarity that felt strangely calm, that he had made a terrible mistake. The current was too strong. The shore was too far. His body, already weakened, already fighting a war on the inside, did not have the strength this fight required. He went under. The world became a churn of brown and gray, of cold pressing in from every side, of his own lungs burning for air he could not find. He thought of Naomi. He thought with a strange detachment that this was a foolish way to die, not from the disease that had been trying to take him for months, but from a river on an ordinary gray afternoon, because he could not let a dog drown. And then he would try for years afterward to describe what happened next, and would never quite find the words, because words are built for ordinary things, and this was not ordinary. He felt something beneath him, not the riverbed, not a rock or a log, something that felt impossibly like being held. He did not see a face. He would tell people that plainly later when they asked, because he never wanted to embellish something that needed no embellishment. He did not hear a voice that spoke in sentences, but he felt, with a certainty that overrode every instinct of panic, a presence beneath the water that was not fighting the current, but moving through it, unbothered, the way a swimmer moves through calm water on a summer day. And he understood, not as a thought, but as something deeper than thought, that he was not alone in the river, that he had perhaps never been alone in any of it. Not the diagnosis, not the long nights of nausea and fear, not the fights he and Naomi had after fights that were really just grief wearing a different coat. Every place he had felt himself drowning, something had been beneath him the entire time. "You are not drowning. I am carrying you." The words did not arrive as sound. They arrived the way warmth arrives when you step from shade into sunlight, total, immediate, requiring no translation. His head broke the surface. He would never be able to explain, in any way that satisfied the part of his mind that wanted explanations, how he came to be near the shallows, near the old sycamore root. Biscuit still clamped awkwardly under his arm, both of them coughing and gasping but alive. The current there was slower, caught in an eddy behind the roots, as though the river itself had set him down gently in the one place it could. Whitfield had seen them from his window and was already coming down the bank with a rope, shouting something Daniel couldn't hear over his own ragged breathing. Between the old man's rope and his own remaining strength, Daniel dragged himself and the dog onto solid ground, and then he simply lay there in the mud and the rain, staring up at a gray sky that had never looked so much like a mercy. He didn't tell Naomi about the presence beneath the water, not that first night. He told her about the current, about Biscuit, about Whitfield's rope and the blanket, and the ambulance the old man had insisted on calling despite Daniel's protests that he was fine. She had cried and shouted and held him all at once, the particular fury of someone who loves a person who has frightened them badly, and he had let her because he understood it, and because some things are better felt than explained. It was 3 weeks later, in the hospital during his next round of treatment, watching the IV drip its slow chemical mercy into his arm, that he finally told her everything. The words that weren't words, the certainty that had no logical foundation and needed none. She was quiet for a long time after he finished, her hand resting on his, and he braced himself for the gentle skepticism he half expected. Naomi was a practical woman, an accountant, someone who trusted spreadsheets more readily than visions. But when she spoke, her voice was thick. "I've been praying every night," she said, "since the diagnosis. I never told you because I didn't want you to think I'd given up on the doctors, but I kept asking, not for a miracle exactly, just for something to carry us, both of us, because I didn't know how much longer I could hold you up on my own." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Maybe that's what you felt. Maybe it was never just about the river." Daniel thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over the way he used to turn over a broken engine, trying to understand its parts. He was not a man who had grown up in church, though his grandmother had taken him a handful of times as a boy, and something of those Sunday mornings, the smell of old wood and candle wax, the low murmur of hymns, had lodged itself somewhere in him without his notice. He did not become, in the months that followed, a man who could explain the universe with confidence. He remained skeptical of easy answers, suspicious of anyone who claimed to have all of it figured out, but he began, slowly, to understand the river as something more than a memory of near death. He began to see it as instruction, because the treatment did not get easier after that afternoon. If anything, the following months brought some of the hardest weeks of his life, a surgery that left him weaker than he had ever been, a recovery that tested every reserve of patience he and Naomi had left. There were nights he lay awake convinced the disease was winning. Mornings he could not lift his head from the pillow without Naomi's help. Days when the fear returned in full force and made a liar of every peaceful moment that had come before. But he found in those nights that he could return to the river. Not literally. He did not go back to that bend of the Kestrel for over a year, but in his mind, in the quiet moments before sleep, he could summon the memory of that pressure beneath him, that sense of being held by something larger and steadier than his own failing strength. And each time he did, some of the panic loosened its grip, not because the fear vanished, it never fully did, but because he no longer believed, the way he once had, that he was facing it alone. He started, without quite meaning to, praying again, clumsily at first, the prayers of a man out of practice, more silence than words. He didn't tell most people about this either. It felt too private, too easily misunderstood by those who wanted either a full conversion story or a full dismissal, and he had no interest in performing his faith for an audience. It was simply his, the way the memory of the river was his, something he returned to in the dark, the way another man might return to a favorite chair. A year and a half after the flood, Daniel's scans came back clear. Not clear for now, clear, full remission, the kind of news that made his oncologist smile in a way doctors don't always allow themselves. He and Naomi cried in the parking garage afterward, sitting in their car with the engine off, saying nothing for a long while because nothing needed saying. That spring, he went back to the river. The Kestrel had returned to its old gentle self, low and clear over smooth stones, birds working the shallows for insects, the old sycamore standing exactly where it always had, its roots forming the same quiet eddy that had once caught him and Biscuit and carried them to safety. Whitfield had passed away that winter, peacefully in his sleep, and Biscuit now lived with Daniel and Naomi, a fact that felt to Daniel like something more than coincidence, though he couldn't have said exactly what. He sat on the bank for a long time, the dog's graying muzzle resting on his knee, and watched the water move. He thought about all the ways a person could drown without ever touching water, in grief, in diagnosis, in the long gray months of fear that follow bad news, in the ordinary loneliness of believing that your strength is the only strength available to you. He thought about how much of his life he had spent believing that survival was a matter of gritting his teeth and doing it alone, and how the river had taught him, was still teaching him, slowly, imperfectly, that this was never quite true. He did not think the flood had been a punishment or a test or any of the other frameworks people sometimes reach for to make suffering make sense. He had stopped needing suffering to make sense. What he believed instead, sitting there with the current moving low and steady past his boots, was simpler than any of that. That somewhere beneath the surface of every hard season of his life, something had been carrying him the whole time, whether he'd had the eyes to see it or not. He didn't need to feel the water close over his head again to know it. He only needed to remember. Naomi found him there an hour later, having guessed correctly where he'd gone. She sat down beside him without a word, and the three of them, Daniel, Naomi, and the old dog between them stayed at the river's edge until the light began to fail, watching the water that had once nearly taken everything and had instead, somehow, given it all back. The end.